This is going to be premature because there's still leasing going on, there's still seismic being shot, there's still wells being drilled. So this is a premature talk. I'm just going to tell you who's doing what, where. We're definitely involved in this play. And the most specific thing you're going to see is Colin showing you some cuttings from our wells, but I can't show any seismic or any specific geology. So here we go. So the Dundee play, Devonian, and there's all the oil and gas wells in the Michigan part of the Michigan Basin. So carbonate reservoirs, most of the reservoirs in the Michigan Basin are from carbonates. There are some sand reservoirs, but majority are from the carbonates. The Traverse, which sits above the Dundee, made 111 million barrels of oil. The Dundee, which we're going to be talking about, 374 million barrels. Detroit River, 100 million. And in Niagara, the largest one, 450 million barrels. Trenton-Black River, 157 million barrels. So here's just a chart showing that breakdown and the total percent of all the carbonates it's made. See the Dundee here, 144 fields, 374 million barrels. So it accounts for 31% of the total carbonate production in the basin. Little log here just showing you the seal here, the Bell Shale, which is usually about 50 to 60 feet thick. Then the Dundee, there's two units, the Roger City, which is more of an argillaceous, tighter rock, and then you get into the reservoir part, the regional reservoir, which is what they call the Reed City, and then below that's the Detroit River. So what I want to show you here, this is a west to east cross-section through the entire state of Michigan. What I want to show you here is that light blue color is that regional porosity in the lower Dundee. So these hydrothermal reservoirs, it's a water drive. You can see where the water is coming from. It's primarily more dolomite to the western part of the basin, and then as you head to the east, it gets more of a limestone. But there's definitely porosity down here, which creates that water drive for these hydrothermal reservoirs. So there are primarily three traps in the Dundee. The pink here is that regional porosity, which is mostly dolomitized. And here, what I'm pointing to are those types of traps, which you have is positive closure on that regional porosity. Primarily, most of the larger fields are from these types of traps. And here's some of the production from those fields. Like here's 50 million barrels, 29 million. So there's some big, large anticlinal features. And that constitutes 64% of the entire Dundee production, that type of trap. The other trap is there's an area here in pink. Dolomite is occurring all the way to the top of the Dundee, and it is hydrothermal in nature. So here, you need that positive closure in order to have a trap here. So that type of trap constitutes 23% of the total Dundee production. And there's still some larger fields here, 22 million there, 15 million. And then the third is what we're going to be talking about or focusing on is the hydrothermal, where you have, again, you guys are familiar with the Trenton-Black River. You have faulting, hydrothermal fluids moving up the faults, and you have dolomization occurring along that. So you have this dolomite chimney occurring and to the top of the Dundee. You can see there's not a whole lot of fields there. So we think there's potential. And here's production from those fields. Deep River Field's the largest, 27 million barrels. That is the most prolific field in the entire Michigan Basin on a per acre basis. But then you can see that 13% of the total Dundee production. So you can see there's a lot of room for exploration. Now these things are smaller, they're harder to find. That's part of that low number, but still we think there's potential there. So I'll give you a timeline of how this play started. The Isabella 35 by Summit Petroleum in 2010. And they ended up drilling two wells. So this number one is that discovery well they drilled. And they offset it with this well to the south. But then all these other wells are all dry holes. Now this was a 2D play. And they drilled, well, them and other competitors drilled these dry holes. Well, they end up shooting a 3D, and well, there you go. It ended up being a 2-well feature. So kind of lesson learned, this is definitely a 3D play. Next, WB Osborne Oil and Gas from Texas, they came in, and they're doing just more classic geology, and I believe they're not even using seismic. They're just using old school geology. And they end up finding this little satellite field off from the Fork field, and that's produced 831,000 barrels so far, and it's still producing. So here is that old Fork field here, and this is their discovery here. And it looks like there's probably a fault here that's kind of separating the two features. Next, in 2014, the Sage area, the Jordan Development and ourselves were involved in as well. The discovery wells, I think, has produced 165,000 barrels, and now it's watered in, but it's still producing some oil. But there's a total of 3 wells here. This is the historic wells here. So we knew there's some hydrothermal dolomization going on. So we end up shooting 3D and discovered these 3 wells, and they've produced 221,000 barrels so far. Next is Sickel, about 2 years later here. Again, there was some pre-existing production on a known field. So we end up shooting a 3D over it just to get a feel of what it looks like. And in the red are those new wells, and we end up finding another feature. So we got a shot over the known, and we got a little bonus. So far, those wells produced 331,000 barrels. You can see the historic wells. Really, it's just these 3 wells, and those 3 wells produce almost 1.2 million barrels. Now, I have to say, they really let those wells go. You know, those wells have potential to produce about 1,200 to 2,000 barrels a day. We're holding it back to 100 barrels a day because we're holding back the water. Because once that water comes in, it's really hold it back. So we're pinching these wells 80 to 100 barrels a day. And then the most recent Curry area, again, there's 2 historic wells there. You know, again, felt like there might be more in the area. And we end up finding 3 more wells. And again, this is pretty recent, and these wells are still producing, but again, we're holding it back to 100 barrels a day. So in terms of activity in the Dundee Formation, which is here in yellow, you can see it's kind of starting to declining here around 2011. The Isabella 35 was discovered there. And so you're starting to see a little increase, and then here's Sage, and then Sickel and Curry. So, you know, that line is going in a positive direction, so that's good. You know, these wells they're being pinched back again, so they can do a lot better than this, but we're just trying to keep the water at bay. Okay, now, if I told you which one's Trenton-Black River core and which one's in Dundee, you probably couldn't tell the difference because it's the same type of mechanism, faulting, hydrothermal dolomization. So the rock's is going to look the same. So now Colin's going to show you examples of cuttings from our wells, and you can see the similarity to the Trenton-Black River.
Thanks, Bill. So just a quick overview. The Dundee and the Michigan Basin, primary fabric types, it has essentially each one of these types of primary porosity types. The porosity generally occurs further down into the regional porosity zone, as Bill was mentioning, those large structures. That's where they're producing out of 50 to 100 feet into the Dundee. When we set up the hydrothermal system, we start to get the vugular and fracture type porosities. However, intercrystalline really is our dominant type that's accounting for most of our reservoir development. When I'm talking about some of the dolomites, I'll classify them as non-planar or anhedral. These are very dense and tight, no porosity present. Planar S are subhedral dolomites, starting to get some planar dolomite faces and a mix of also irregular faces. This is very low porosity, essentially just traces. And then our reservoir grade is planar E or euhedral type dolomites. These are nice rhombic dolomites, typically very finely crystalline to microcrystalline and highly sucrosic and porous. So this is an overview of many of the hydrothermal facies that we see in the Dundee. The upper left corner is actually a neomorphosed limestone. So this has been recrystallized from nearby location to elevated temperatures. We also see this piece right here is a piece of white hydrothermal dolomite. It's anhedral in nature. So it's still not a whole lot of porosity development here, not enough fluid flow to really dolomitize this system, but the elevated temperatures are altering it. We use alizarin red S staining. So anything that's stained red for the rest of this talk is calcium carbonate that takes a stain. Any dolomite does not take the stain. So we see this fracture being filled by hydrothermal dolomite. It's anhedral and finely crystalline, so there's no porosity. We can also tell there's no porosity in this tight limestone. It's microcrystalline and anhedral. In the upper right, we have white subhedral dolomite. We have late stage calcite, occluding any remaining porosity in this unit. We can see some of the small irregularly shaped red, that's all calcite, occluding some of the pores. The bottom left is what we call the dolomite cap. It's anhedral, very dense, dark in color, and microcrystalline, no porosity whatsoever. Next, we're going into our reservoir zone. So these are some highly sucrosic euhedral dolomite crystals. As you can see, intercrystalline porosity is dominant here. Once we get the intercrystalline porosity development, that results in solution collapse, and we get larger vugular pore types. So that's where we get these saddle dolomite cements, also known as Baroque dolomite. It's got known hydrothermal systems for having this curved crystal face, common in the Trenton-Black River type systems. And over here, we just have an aggregate of these crystals showing us that we have large vugular pores. We also have some black bitumen on top of these. So I'm going to start with some of unaltered Dundee limestone, and I'm going to move from the top of the section down into the regional porosity zone, the Reed City zone. And I'll move into these slightly altered zones and then highly dolomitized reservoir zones. So as we can see, the capped dolomite generally within 5 feet of the bell shale contact. Very dense microcrystalline, darker in color. As we can see, the entire thing's taking a stain. So it very frequently has any allochems throughout it and no porosity. This is an important zone because this is really what's hosting our hydrothermal dolomite type reservoirs. This is commonly described in the literature in driller's logs and in well files as being a salt and pepper limestone. It's soft and granular. As we can see up here, the entire thing takes a stain, no alteration, and very low porosity. Next, getting into the more regional, the Reed City type zone, off structure, so away from some of the Mount Pleasant or Dundee or Buckeye type fields, we start to get increased how soft the limestone is and more granular, not a whole lot of recrystallization or alteration. As we move on structure, we have remnants of corals. So some of the production in Buckeye and Mount Pleasant type fields are from bioherm complexes or fenestrol lime mudstones. This one has some growth framework type porosity remaining, and it's been recrystallized. So we have more fluid flow on structure kind of to be expected. Top of the Dundee in a slightly altered zone. So this is early stage dilation, increased stress causing microfracturing. We have this tight limestone cap here with tight anhedral dolomite cement. And we have similar occurrence over here on the right side with tight anhedral limestone at the top, the fractures being occluded by early stage calcite. Once again, moving down into our host zone in the Rogers City zone, we have calcite occluding a fracture through the kind of salt and pepper granular limestone. As we can see right at the end, the termination of some of these fractures or calcite crystals, we do have traces of bitumen, so we do still have traces of porosity in this sample. In the regional porosity or Reed City zone, we have this dolomitized coral, still have some more growth framework type of porosity. We also do have some examples of early stage moldic solutioning and then once again early stage moldic cementation. This is all microsucrosic dolomite. These were likely originally branching bryozoans. And moving into our hydrothermal dolomite type units, this is the cap dolomite. So this is the contact between the Dundee. We can see the Dundee is the darker, and then we've got the gray shale from the overlying bell shale. It's our capping shale. A little bit closer zoomed in, look at it right here. We have this white dolomite, including fractures. This is completely dolomitized here, anhedral microcrystalline, very dense and tight. This is a possible zebra type fabric, as we've seen in Trenton-Black River. It's hard to tell at this scale, the cutting scale, but once again, a similar occurrence up here in the upper right. As we move to the bottom right, we do have the transition into more of a reservoir grade subhedral type texture of dolomite. So in our reservoir zone, we have once again seeing this aggregate of saddle dolomite crystals coming from a vugular pore. We have saddle dolomite crystals precipitating directly off of the dense dolomite cap. And these right side pictures are more commonly what we'll see as we're drilling into the Dundee reservoir. Drill is extremely fine. It's extremely brittle because of the high porosity. And as we can see, we do have traces of white dolomite throughout, but it becomes more dominant towards the tan brown microsucrosic euhedral dolomite crystals. As we move into this sample here, we see an increase of the white dolomite. So this is telling us that we do have a little bit more of a vugular type porosity relative to what we see up here in the upper right, which is more of the intercrystalline type porosity. And just a couple of key things that we can pull out of this detailed cutting analysis, kind of just a step above what our typical mud logs will look at. So this rhomb right here, this is a sample of dolomite. Just looking at this by itself, we can tell a couple stages of paragenesis are occurring. We have fluid evolution, as we can see this lighter band around the outside. That's a mineralogical change. That means that our fluids are replenishing and solutioning and reprecipitating out in these reservoirs. We're getting evolution of the types of rocks that are precipitating. Also, we do have a little bit of a cross hatchwork, kind of hard to see on this slide right here, but that frequently at the finer scale at fluid inclusion type level indicates that these dolomites have been recrystallized. So it's another stage that is being added to these reservoirs. Another piece of evidence we have for excellent porosity are these selenite crystals. The size of the selenite crystal essentially tells us that we have pore spaces at least this large, and these are also associated with just MVT type or hydrothermal type systems. So just in the samples that I showed you right here, we can start to piece together the reservoir paragenesis, look at this in different locations across the Michigan Basin, and try and determine where's our best zone for porosity development. As we can see, the white boxes are pore generating, black boxes are generally pore occluding. So essentially dilation, microfracturing, and faulting fracturing is where we really set up our hydrothermal system. And that's where we begin solutioning and dolomitization and reprecipitation of dolomite cements. So that's really our key to try and focus on this area and document it where it occurs, at what's most favorable for our future exploration. So on that note, thank you very much.